Hello everybody, and welcome to Scary Teller's newest feature on introverts extroverting, an author's corner. This is a section where we highlight some authors and their different types of works, whether it be horror novels, short stories, whatever the case may be. For the first installment, we're going to highlight the author Scott M. Baker. This is Cruise of the Living Dead, a zombie anthology. Part 1, Cruise of the Living Dead. The briny smell of salt water drifted in through the porthole. Carissa Banning stood by the opening, inhaling deeply. Several decks below, she could hear the ocean slapping against the side of the cruise ship. A feeling of utter contentment washed over her. She loved the ocean, which was not surprising since she had grown up in the coastal city of Rockport, Massachusetts. It was one of the reasons she had gone to medical school, to help her fellow man while making enough money so she could eventually retire to the New England coast. Then, during her last year of residency, she got an epiphany. Why spend 20 or 30 years in some clinic treating colds and mending broken bones, hoping someday to live by the sea, when she could fulfill both desires as a cruise line doctor? Finding an available position was difficult, but between her grades and some glowing recommendations from the hospital where she interned, 6 months ago she had finagled a position aboard the SSC Princess. Now every day she stood by the porthole to take in the sights and sounds of the ocean, marveling at her good fortune. Carissa was exactly where she wanted to be. The door to the sick bay abruptly opened, snapping Carissa out of her reverie. "Hey Doc, I got a couple of patients for you." The voice belonged to Bobby, one of the ship's stewards. He frequently dropped in to say hello and bring her coffee. Carissa knew that Bobby liked her, but was too shy to ask her out. Probably because she was 10 years his senior. Today he had an unusual urgency in his voice. "Coming," Carissa moved away from the porthole and stepped in the examination room. Bobby helped a middle-aged man up onto the exam table. A large wound on the man's shoulder and a smaller one on his right forearm both oozed blood, the former staining his Hawaiian shirt. A woman with shoulder-length blonde hair stood nearby, cradling her left arm, which also dripped blood from a nasty-looking wound around her wrist. A boy about 8 years old and his older sister stood off to the side, the girl nervously twirling her auburn ponytail. Carissa stepped over to the exam table, pulled a white pair of rubber gloves from a cardboard storage box and slid them on. "Who do we have here?" Bobby stepped aside so Carissa could examine the man. "This is Mr. Lansdowne and his family. He and Mrs. Lansdowne were bit by some nut while ashore. Everything will be alright, so just relax." Carissa adopted her most soothing bedside manner. She gently slid off Mr. Lansdowne's shirt, pausing only when he winced from the pain. "Tell me what happened." As Carissa examined the wounds, Mr. Lansdowne related how he and his family had gone ashore that morning to visit the Bermudan countryside. While touring an old sugar plantation, the family had come across a man, dazed and bloodied. When they tried to help the man, he attacked them, biting the father in the shoulder and attempting to tear out a chunk of flesh. Mr. Lansdowne held the attacker's head in place with his left hand while punching him with the right, which was when the attacker bit his arm. Mrs. Lansdowne received her bite when she tried to pull the attacker off of her husband. Mr. Lansdowne eventually crippled the man with a kick to the knee, rushed his family back to the car, and returned to the ship. The wounds were deep and would definitely leave scars, but thankfully none of the injuries appeared to be life-threatening. Carissa irrigated the bites with the diluted water povidone iodine solution, stitched the wounds closed, and gave father and mother a heavy dose of penicillin to fight off infection. "Any idea why he attacked you?" asked Carissa, as she stuck a syringe into Mrs. Lansdowne's arm and pressed the plunger. "None." Mr. Lansdowne sat in a chair, cradling his right arm and massaging the area around the dressing. "Other than that, he was a friggin' nut." "He didn't say anything?" "Just moaned a lot, like he was in pain. He had several bite marks on him and was covered in blood, and he looked sick." "How so?" Carissa removed the syringe from Mrs. Lansdowne's arm, placed the cover over the needle, and tossed it in the biohazard bin. "His skin was blotchy and discolored." Mr. Lansdowne closed his eyes and twisted his neck. "Are you okay?" "Just a little stiff and lightheaded. Probably stress catching up with me." "Maybe," said Carissa. She stepped over to Mr. Lansdowne and placed her palm against his forehead. "You're running a fever. Is that bad? With your other symptoms, I can't rule out the possibility the man who attacked you may have given you rabies." Mrs. Lansdowne gasped. "Is that fatal?" "It's not as bad as it sounds," Carissa smiled. "You and your husband only just got bit, so there's little chance that the infection has become acute, assuming you even have rabies. I'll take some saliva, blood, and skin samples from both of you for testing. In the meantime, let me start you on a regimen of vaccines and rabies antibodies." Carissa went about taking the samples and administering the shots as casually as possible, assuring the family that in a few days they would be lounging around the pool with this unfortunate event behind them. The Sea Princess left Bermuda the same night Carissa treated the father and mother. Over the next 2 days, she spent her time treating an idiot who gave himself alcohol poisoning during a drinking binge on shore, a retiree who developed a severe food allergy, and a college student who required stitches after cracking her head on the diving board. It was not until their second day out of port that Carissa realized the Lansdownes had not come back for their follow-up visit. After lunch, she prepared a set of syringes with the second round of vaccines and rabies antibodies, packed into the porthole medical bag, and went to pay a cabin call. As Carissa entered the main deck, she ran into Bobby, who greeted her with a smile. He gestured toward the medical bag. "Who's sick?" "I'm checking on the Lansdownes." "Lansdownes?" Bobby mentally sorted through the passenger list until the name finally registered. "That's the family that was attacked back in Bermuda." "The same." Carissa lifted the bag. "It's time for their next round of shots." "Come to think of it, no one has heard from them since we left port. Mind if I tag along to check on things?" "No problem." As they approached Lansdowne's cabin, Carissa noticed a maid service cart standing out front. As the more petite of the two maids arranged cleaning supplies, her raven-haired companion knocked on the door. When the maid got no response, she unlocked the door, pushed it halfway open, and leaned inside. "Room service, can we come in and clean?" The maid's question devolved into a scream. Mr. Lansdowne shoved the door open and stumbled out, snarling at the 4 people gathered in the corridor. Everyone paused, taken aback by his appearance. A bluish-black discoloration covered his exposed skin. At first, Carissa thought the rabies had progressed more rapidly than normal, until she caught a whiff of the odor. It had been a while since she last smelt it, dating back to her internship in the Pittsburgh hospital emergency room, but she could never completely force from her memory the sickening sweet smell of rotting flesh. Before anyone could react, Mr. Lansdowne shoved the raven-haired maid against the wall and plunged his teeth into her face. He flicked his head to the side, ripping off the maid's nose and upper lip. The maid screamed even louder, an anguished howl of terror and pain. Blood spurt from the wound, splattering across the walls as the maid thrashed around, trying to break free. The violence of the assault shocked Carissa into inactivity, but the numbness lasted only a few seconds. She dropped to her knees and vomited when Mr. Lansdowne swallowed the maid's flesh. The petite maid reacted first, stepping behind Mr. Lansdowne. She wrapped her left arm around his neck, careful to keep away from his mouth, and tried to pull him off of her coworker. Mrs. Lansdowne emerged from out of the room, grabbed the petite maid by the shoulders, and chomped into the back of her neck. Releasing her grip from Mr. Lansdowne, the petite maid used her hands to batter at the wife's face, trying to break the death grip. Mr. Lansdowne yanked off a chunk of flesh and chewed it. She turned around and shoved the petite maid, who banged into the cleaning cart and toppled over backwards. The 2 Lansdownes fell upon her, fingers and teeth tearing into the anguished woman's stomach. The raven-haired maid slid down the wall and sat in a growing pool of her own blood, slipping into shock. Carissa snapped herself back to reality and moved to help the maids. But Bobby grabbed her by the arm. Carissa jerked free. "What are you doing?" "I'll handle this. You get the other passengers off this deck, then go warn the captain." "What about the kids?" A set of high-pitched moans came from the cabin. Carissa and Bobby watched as the Lansdowne children, or what remained of them, stepped into the corridor. The girl's right arm hung limp by her side, most of the skin and muscle having been chewed off below the elbow, leaving only strips of flesh and tissue dangling from where it was attached to the bone. Her brother stood to her rear, swaying unsteadily, several feet of intestine dangling out of the hole gnawed into his abdomen. The siblings stared at Carissa and Bobby through lifeless gray eyes. Before either could attack, the raven-haired maid leaning up against the wall groaned, attracting their attention. The siblings set upon the maid, each feeding off of her face wound. "Warn the others," ordered Bobby. Carissa barely heard him. She mentally tried to force the grotesque image from her mind, but it burned into her psyche, closing down her mental processes and paralyzing her with fear. Bobby spun her around to face him and slapped her hard across the face. The stinging brought Carissa back to her senses. You need to get everyone off this deck now. Carissa nodded weakly and backed down the corridor toward the elevator. Bobby raced into the carnage. He grabbed the little girl by the ponytail and half-eaten arm and pulled her off of the raven-haired maid. Raw flesh and muscle separated from the woman, the chunks still clenched between the girl's teeth. The maid showed no reaction. Bobby flung the girl back into the cabin and turned to grab her brother. Carissa moved down the corridor, pounding on each door she passed. Thankfully, most passengers were topside enjoying the cruise. Those who emerged from their cabins only needed to glance down the corridor and were more than convinced to leave. Carissa got as far as the 5th cabin when yelling distracted her. "Stay back," Bobby was yelling to a burly man in sweatpants and a Patriot shirt who ran down the corridor from the opposite direction to help. The Lansdowne parents stood and lumbered toward him. Each grabbed hold of the burly man and dragged him to the floor, tearing into him with teeth and fingers. As Carissa watched, Bobby pushed past the cleaning cart, but never made it. The raven-haired maid darted out a hand and clasped Bobby by the ankle, holding him in place. Reaching up with her other hand, the maid grabbed Bobby by the pants leg and pulled herself up, hand over hand, clawing her way up his belt and shirt until she stood erect. Bobby tried to shove her off, but could not get enough leverage. With an animalistic snarl, the maid sank her teeth into Bobby's neck. He cried out, his howl drowned out by a gurgling as blood filled his throat. "Bobby!" Carissa started back down the corridor to assist her friend, stopping short when the Lansdowne children stepped out of the cabin and fixed their gaze on her. Their mouths chewed in anticipation, spilling blood and gore across decaying lips. Carissa gasped when the children plodded toward her. She backed down the corridor, keeping her back against the wall, never taking her eyes off the children. Something metal slammed into Carissa's back. Looking over her shoulder, she saw a wall-mounted fire extinguisher pressing against her. Grabbing it, Carissa aimed the nozzle at the girl's face and squeezed the trigger. A blast of CO2 hit the girl square in the face, momentarily blinding her. She veered to the right and smacked face first into the wall, grunting in frustration. Carissa shot another blast of CO2 into the girl's face, took a few steps towards the approaching brother and blasted him twice. As the children tried to regain their orientation, Carissa moved back down the corridor, knocking on doors to alert passengers to the danger. 7 cabins and 2 more evacuated families later, Carissa arrived at the last door and knocked frantically. A voice from deep inside the cabin yelled, "Piss off, asshole!" "Open up!" Carissa banged on the door even harder. "This is an emergency." 3 more pounds. "You have to evacuate this deck now!" The cabin door swung open violently. A man naked, except for a towel wrapped around his waist, stood in the doorway. "Are you deaf, bitch? I told you to." A collective set of moans cut off his tirade. Carissa and the naked man both glanced down the corridor as a horde of living dead swarmed them. The Lansdowne family and the 2 maids spread across the corridor, with the burly would-be rescuer limping along behind on a badly chewed leg, struggling to keep up. The naked man's jaw dropped open. "What the? We have to make a run for it." "Let me get my wife." The naked man ducked back into the cabin, yelling for his wife to hurry up. Carissa raised the nozzle of the fire extinguisher and stepped forward to confront the living dead. She gave each of the Lansdownes and the maids a 3-second burst to the face, slowing their advance. At best, she bought herself a few seconds. Glancing over her shoulder, the naked man and his wife still had not left their cabin. "Hurry up!" Carissa yelled, as she aimed the nozzle at Mr. Lansdowne and blasted him in the face a second time. The raven-haired maid let out an angry growl and lunged. Carissa raised the nozzle and pressed the trigger, but nothing came out. The pressure indicator confirmed her fears. The extinguisher was empty. Raising the cylinder as she slammed the base into the maid's face, shattering several teeth and fracturing the exposed skull. Yet the injuries barely slowed her down. Carissa backed up toward the cabin. "We're out of time!" she yelled, when alongside the open door. The man emerged from his cabin, this time wearing trousers, pulling along an attractive brunette who was yanking her jeans up over her thighs. When the brunette saw the living dead only a few yards back, she screamed and ran back into the cabin. The Lansdowne children and the petite maid pushed their way inside after her. Crying out for his wife, the man tried to pull 3 living dead back into the corridor, only to be set upon from behind by the rest of the Lansdowne family and the raven-haired maid. They dragged him to the floor and clawed open his chest. The terrified screams of the wife and the howls of pain from her husband drowned out all other sounds. Carissa turned and ran down the corridor until she reached the forward bank of the elevators. She frantically jabbed at the call button until she heard the car begin its descent to her deck. A groan caused her to spin around. The burly man with the half-eaten leg made his way past the feeding frenzy and staggering towards her, seeking fresh meat. He was only 3 yards away. Carissa glanced up at the indicator. 3 decks to go. The elevator would never get here in time. Carissa raised the fire extinguisher and drove the base into the burly man's face. It barely phased him. Carissa smashed him in the face again, only this time harder. The burly man swayed momentarily and lunged. In desperation, Carissa swung the extinguisher like a bat, connecting with the side of his head. This time, the blow knocked him up against the wall, where he dropped onto his good knee. Carissa swung the extinguisher again. A loud crack echoed down the corridor as the burly man's skull shattered, driving fragments of bone into its brain. It convulsed several times before falling to the ground, motionless. A metallic ping announced the arrival of the elevator. As the doors slid open, Carissa ran inside and pressed a button for the main deck, and then flung herself against the rear wall. Only when the doors closed and the elevator began its ascent did Carissa drop to her knees and sob uncontrollably. By the time Carissa entered the bridge, news of the carnage on the main deck had already arrived. Uneasiness gripped the crew, charging the air like static electricity. The tension was palpable, with the crew self-consciously going about their business, looking to each other for reassurance, rather than performing with their usual confidence. Carissa had seen them like this once before when the ship got caught up in an unexpected violent storm that almost caused the vessel to flounder. It did nothing to calm her anxiety. The only person who did not appear to be in a state of near panic was Captain Jurgensen, a veteran of 26 years with the cruise line. He stood by the command chair, the ship's intercom phone wedged between his shoulder and ear. After several minutes, the captain replaced the receiver and turned to the bridge crew. "Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation developing down on the main deck. That includes casualties and possible fatalities. A disturbance has broken out, and passengers are attacking each other." "They're eating each other," announced Carissa. The crew stared at Carissa as if she had lost her mind. The captain folded his arms across his chest and studied her through squinted eyes, barely concealing his anger at having to deal with such nonsense. "Explain." "I was down on the main deck when it started. I went to check on the Lansdowns, who came to the infirmary 2 days ago after having been bitten by some nut back in Bermuda. When the maids opened the door to their cabin, the family attacked and began eating the maids and several passengers." "Eating?" Jurgensen's tone warned Carissa that she ran the risk of being removed from the bridge. "Captain, I know it sounds crazy, but I saw the whole thing. The Lansdowns attacked and ate Bobby, 2 maids and several passengers. Several minutes after being killed, the maids and passengers came back to life and attacked other passengers, just like in one of those zombie movies." A chorus of snickers floated through the bridge. For a moment, Carissa thought she had overplayed her hand and expected to be escorted back to her cabin. Instead, Jurgensen unfolded his arms and looked out over the ocean. The snickering at her expense suddenly stopped. After nearly a minute of silence, the first mate, Commander Travis, stepped over to Jurgensen, though he spoke in a soft voice. His words carried through the deafening silence on the bridge. "Is everything all right, Captain?" "Far from it." Jurgensen turned and crossed the bridge to Carissa. "You said the Lansdowns were infected prior to their attacking the others? With what?" "At first I thought it was rabies, but the infection spread too quickly. Besides, rabies can drive its victims insane and make them vicious, but I've never heard of a case where it caused victims to eat each other." "What's your assessment?" Carissa inhaled briskly, not quite certain how to answer. "I have no idea what type of infection we're dealing with, but from what I've seen, it's highly virulent. Even a single bite causes death in as little as a few minutes, depending on the severity of the wound. What are the chances of stopping the infection?" "Maybe it shouldn't be stopped." The statement came from Reverend Stiles, the ship's chaplain and a devout Baptist. Stiles stood by the entrance to the bridge. "What's that supposed to mean?" demanded Jurgensen. "Maybe this is not an infectious outbreak after all." Reverend Stiles advanced toward the captain, summoning his courage. "Perhaps we're witnessing some sort of miracle, a divine retribution to punish us for our sins." "You can't be serious." "Doubt if you want," Reverend Stiles responded, "but if you've read the Bible, you'll realize resurrection is a common theme. Lazarus was brought back to life, and Jesus himself rose from the dead on the 3rd day. I do read the Bible. I just don't recall Jesus rising from the dead and then eating his disciples. Jurgensen focused his attention back to Carissa. Miss Banning, I'll ask you again. What are the chances of bringing this outbreak under control? Carissa sighed and shook her head. I don't have the expertise to handle something like this, so our chances of stopping it are next to impossible. Best we can do is to contain its spread and get the uninfected off the ship as soon as possible. Jurgensen stared at Carissa. She could not tell if the cold, hard eyes reflected his disappointment with her lack of capabilities or his acceptance of the harsh reality. In either case, Carissa was a useless fraud, completely out of her element. She felt humiliated, none of which was assuaged by Jurgensen's response. Head below and try to get as many passengers topside as possible. God help you if you're wrong, Miss Banning. The captain walked past Carissa, pausing just long enough to place a reassuring hand on her shoulder. God help us all if you're right. It took less than an hour for Carissa to clear all the passengers off of the guest decks, or more precisely those passengers who had survived the outbreak. Most of those on the upper levels were already alerted to the carnage taking place below them, and as such were easily removed to the boat deck, one level above the main deck. Checking on the lower decks was more problematic. From main deck on down, every major stairway was filled with the living dead. Carissa reasoned that because of their limited mobility, it was easier for the living dead to descend rather than climb. She scanned the lobby deck, looking for a safe way down, eventually finding a service stairwell not infested with zombies, and descended to the lower decks. Carissa walked into the charnel house. The main deck and the one beneath were completely overrun by the living dead. At each level, Carissa carefully opened the service door and peered into the corridor. Each time she found scores of zombies roaming the corridors and feeding off of those unfortunate enough not to escape. Muffled screaming and cries for help warned her that some passengers remained trapped in their cabins. However, with each deck swarming with zombies, and with the only weapon at her disposal being the semi-automatic pistol issued to her from the ship's arms locker, any attempt to save them would have been suicide. On the last deck she checked, Carissa quietly closed and locked the door, rationalizing her decision by telling herself the survivors would be safer in their cabins until a full-scale rescue could be mounted. After disconnecting the power to all the elevators between the passenger decks so no zombie could inadvertently make its way topside, Carissa returned to the bridge. She found the situation there bordering on breakdown. Jurgensen stood by the main console, yelling into the ship's intercom phone every few seconds, demanding that someone answer. His usual confidence had given way to fear and frustration that infected the rest of the bridge crew. They nervously glanced back and forth to each other, trying to find strength amongst themselves, but only found mutual uncertainty and despair. Even Commander Travis seemed at a loss for action, hovering a few feet from the captain but too nervous to approach. Carissa slid up beside the first officer. "What's going on?" Travis shrugged. "The captain got a call from shore about 5 minutes ago that upset him. He's been trying to call the engine room ever since, but with no luck." "Any idea what the call was about?" "None, but the Jurgensen slammed the receiver back into its cradle and cursed under his breath, and then stared out over the ocean. Travis cautiously stepped forward. "Is everything all right, Captain?" "No," Jurgensen sighed. He faced the bridge crew. "I just got off the phone with Norfolk. I've been advised that the Navy is sending the Mitscher out to meet us, and that we should hold our position until they arrive." That's good news, right?" Travis looked to the crew, hoping to bolster the morale. Jurgensen looked at Travis the way a strict schoolmaster would a student who had blurted out the wrong answer in class. "The Mitscher is a destroyer. The Navy's not coming here to rescue us. They're coming to sink us." "Why would they do that?" asked Travis. "To keep the infection from spreading to the mainland," answered Carissa. She felt a cold shiver race down her spine as the full impact of the words set in. "What the hell do you know?" snapped Brian, the navigator. "Miss Banning's right," Jurgensen said with a quiet resignation to his voice. "If this outbreak ever reached a populated area like Norfolk, it could spread across the United States in a few months. Washington can't take the risk, and I don't blame them." "So what do we do now?" asked Travis. "Try to outrun them?" Jurgensen shook his head. "If we run, the Navy will hunt us down and sink us without a second thought. Our only chance is to come to a full stop, put the uninfected into light boats, and set them adrift. Once the Navy has sunk the Sea Princess, maybe we can convince them to bring the survivors aboard one at a time, check them for wounds, and rescue those who aren't infected. Makes sense, agreed Travis. Except I can't reach the engine room. Jurgensen rested his hands on the edge of the control console and bowed his head while he contemplated the next move. It only took him a few seconds to formulate a plan of action. When he next lifted his head, the usual confidence had returned to his eyes, only now bolstered by a determination not to give up without a fight. Mr. Travis, head down to the engine room, find out what's going on, and stop this ship. I don't care how you do it. Every minute we're moving decreases our chances of getting out of this alive. Take Miss Banning and Mr. Kennedy with you. I'll have the crew prepare the passengers to abandon ship. Once you've stopped the ship, we'll get the uninfected to safety. Any questions? Travis stood at attention. None, sir. Good, move out. With Travis leading the way, the engine room team headed out. As they were about to exit the bridge, Jurgensen called out to his first officer. Mr. Travis, be careful. God knows what you'll find down there. The team made their way to the bridge toward the stern. As they exited the ship's interior onto the promenade deck, a terrible din greeted them from below. Carissa moved to the railing and peered over. 2 stories below, on the boat deck, over 1,500 passengers filled the ship's length, crowding into every available space. Even from up here, Carissa could sense the fear and uncertainty smoldering among the frightened people, threatening to ignite into a full panic. Scattered throughout the throng, crew members tried to calm them, promising they would soon be boarding the lifeboats and moving away from the liner to safely wait for rescue. The crew succeeded in talking down the passengers for now, but the terror still simmered beneath the surface, ready to be set off by the slightest provocation. Carissa and the others had to stop the ship soon. Just forward of midship, Travis led the team back inside and guided them to a service elevator. Removing a key from his pocket, he inserted it into the control panel and turned it to the right. The doors slid open. Travis entered first, followed by Carissa and Kennedy. The first officer inserted the key into the inner control panel, turned it to the right, and pressed the button for the lowest deck. As the elevator began its jerky descent, Travis removed the semi-automatic from his holster, flipped off the safety, and clasped the weapon in both hands, ready to fire. Is that necessary? Asked Carissa. Something cut off communications with the engine room, Travis answered sternly. How confident are you it was just a mechanical failure? Carissa withdrew her own sidearm and checked the safety. The elevator came to a halt on the lowest deck of the ship, and the doors slid open. Carissa half expected a horde of zombies to swarm in on them. Instead, the team was greeted with an eerie stillness that contrasted with the frenetic energy topside. They stepped out into the passageway, sidearms at the ready. Carissa peered down the passageway in both directions, surprised to find no signs of life. Usually the engine room was one of the busiest areas of the ship, but now there were no indications that anyone was ever down here. No movement, no noise. The only sound came from the steady, background hum generated by the engines, which reverberated through the hull. Travis used the key to lock the elevator into place, and then slid it into his jacket pocket. He pointed to the stern and set off for the engine room. The passageway stretched for nearly 100 feet before ending against a bulkhead. The 3 crewmen slowly moved toward the bulkhead, pausing at each hatch to make certain it was secure. Every few seconds, Carissa glanced over her shoulder to see if anything was following them, relieved to see nothing there. At the end of the passageway, a small flight of iron steps led up to the hatch in the engine room bulkhead. Travis grabbed the wheel lock and pulled. The heavy metal hatch swung open. Kennedy stepped up beside Travis and whispered, "I thought the engine room was battened down." "It's supposed to be." Travis pulled open the hatch and stepped through, followed by Kennedy. Carissa took the sidearm in her left hand, rubbed her palm against her skirt, and switched it back. With a deep sigh to steady her nerves, she stepped through the hatch. They stood on a grated metal landing just inside the hatch. The engine room was cavernous compared to the rest of the ship, being 30 feet high and extending back 100 feet, dominated by the enormous diesel engine. Pipes, air ducts, and steel supports for the catwalks crisscrossed the area, blocking their full vision. The roar of the engine drowned out all other noises. Carissa had been down here 3 months previous to tend an engineer who got an arm caught in some machinery. Everything was as she remembered it, except for one factor. This time, mixed in with the smells of oil, diesel fuel, and sweat, was a coppery odor she knew all too well: blood. Travis led the way along the catwalk deeper into the engine room, then suddenly stopped and held his hand for the others to do likewise. He pointed toward the base of the metal stairs in front of them. Carissa followed his line of sight. In front of the engine's command console, 5 of the engineer crew lay scattered across the floor, their torsos torn open and their intestines yanked out. Organs and severed limbs were strewn around. Blood dripped from the metal grating. 3 zombies knelt amongst the bodies, feeding off the dead. Travis looked over at Kennedy and Carissa. He lifted his forefinger and pointed to each of the zombies as he mouthed the words, "1 shot each to the head." Carissa shook her head repeatedly. "I'm not a good shot," she whispered. "I can't do it." The look of disgust Travis flashed her hurt more than her own sense of uselessness. Travis focused his attention on Kennedy and spoke in a hush. "You take the middle one. I'll get the 2 on each end." Kennedy nodded and raised his sidearm, aiming at the center zombie's head. Carissa winced as the gunshots rang out, the sound amplified many times in the confined space. The heads of the 2 closest zombies exploded. Their bodies spasmed for a second before slumping down over the crewman. Looking up from its meal, the 3rd zombie snarled. Travis fired a single round into his face, blowing the back of its skull and brains across the engine room. The 3 humans ran down the stairs toward the console. Carissa felt her shoes squishing on the gore as she crossed the landing. Kennedy looked down at one of the zombies. "How the hell did these things get in here?" "It doesn't matter now," Travis said. He slid his sidearm back between his trousers and the small of his back. "Help me shut the engine down. Carissa, keep your eyes open for any more of those things." As the 2 men went about their business, Carissa scanned the compartment. She thought she heard a faint moaning, but could not be sure where it came from. She stepped to the opposite end of the landing, thinking maybe a wounded crew member had crawled away to safety, but saw nothing. The moaning sounded again, this time louder. Then a second and third set of moans joined in the ghastly chorus. A metallic clank from overhead caught her attention. Carissa looked up to see 3 zombies dressed in engine garb moving along the catwalk above her, their lifeless eyes fixed on the 3 humans below. "We've got company," she yelled. "Stop them," cried Travis, working frantically. "We need a few more minutes." Carissa saw that the catwalk led to the landing by the main hatch. She raced to head them off. By now the first of the zombies had reached the stairs, swaying from side to side as it descended. Carissa raised the firearm and pulled the trigger. The round hit it in the right shoulder, punching a chunk of rotten flesh out its back and knocking the zombie off balance, but doing nothing to stop its advance. She raised the barrel a little higher and fired again. The round whizzed by the zombie's head. By now it was only a few feet away. Carissa stepped forward and shoved the barrel into the zombie's face. It snarled and lunged just as she pulled the trigger. The round tore into the zombie's brow between his eyes, disintegrating its head. It dropped to the landing with a sickening thud. Swallowing the bile rising in her throat, she aimed the firearm at the second zombie and waited until it was 5 feet away. The round tore off the zombie's jaw and blew off the rear of its head, knocking it backwards onto the stairs. The third zombie lunged at Carissa, tripping over the bodies in front of it. Carissa jumped back as the third zombie nearly fell on top of her. Before it could get up, she placed the barrel against the back of its head and squeezed the trigger. Its skull exploded like a ripe melon, showering her in gore. A new set of moans caught Carissa's attention. She looked up to the catwalk in time to see 4 more zombies lumbering her direction. "I can't hold them off much longer." "Got it," Travis' voice echoed through the compartment as the engine went silent. "Let's haul ass." Travis and Kennedy raced for the main hatch, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Carissa fired at the lead zombie as it started down, but her aim was low. The round shattered its kneecap, causing it to tumble forward and crash to the landing in front of her. Before she could fire again, Travis pushed her towards the hatch. "Go, I got this!" She climbed through the hatch into the passageway, with Kennedy close behind. Travis took down the second and third zombie with headshots, and then turned to join the others. As he bent to exit through the hatch, the zombie Carissa had only wounded in the knee grabbed Travis by the ankle. and pulled itself up his leg. Travis spun the firearm to shoot it just as the fourth zombie lumbered off the stairs, landing on top of him. Travis fell back against the hatch, slamming it shut. The two sets of teeth bit into his flesh. Carissa headed back for the hatch, but before she could open it, Travis spun the wheel from inside the engine room, locking the bolts in place. "Travis!" Carissa pounded on the steel hatch. Kennedy placed his hands on his shoulders and pulled her away, gently backing her down the stairs. "It's no use. You can't help him now." More moaning caught Carissa's attention. She glanced down the passageway to see a dozen zombies heading in their direction. They were already less than 50 feet distant, halfway between them and the elevator. Carissa slumped to the deck. "We're trapped." "No, we're not." Kennedy grabbed Carissa by the arm and forced her to her feet. He led her down the passageway toward the zombies, stopping at the first hatch on the right. "We still have the emergency ladder." The two made it to the hatch to the emergency ladder seconds before the zombies. Kennedy spun the wheel, undodged the bolts, and pulled open the hatch. Using it for cover, he aimed the sidearm down the passageway and fired a rapid volley at the approaching horde. Several of the living dead sustained headshots and crumbled to the deck. "Hurry!" Carissa climbed through the opening. The space was only 3 feet square and lit by a single emergency bulb encased in dirty plastic cover. A metal ladder on the opposite wall ascended up through the decks. She started climbing, pausing after a few feet to yell out, "Come on!" Jumping into the confined space, Kennedy tried to close the hatch behind him. 3 sets of dead hands grabbed the rim and yanked it open, knocking him off balance. Before he could regain his footing, one of the zombies reached in and clasped Kennedy by the arm with both hands. Kennedy placed the barrel of his sidearm against one of the wrists and pulled the trigger, severing the dead hand. When he placed the firearm against the other wrist, he saw the bolt was locked back in its open position, signifying he had expended his ammunition. Chris had heard Kennedy curse. She looked down just as a second zombie leaned through the hatch and grabbed Kennedy's other arm. Together, the two pulled Kennedy through the hatch into the passageway where the living dead began to feed off of him. Carissa started down the ladder to see if she can help. A third zombie fell through the open hatch onto the floor of the enclosed compartment. When it caught sight of Carissa, its mouth opened, the gnawed-away lips giving a clear view of gums and gore-covered teeth as it chewed the air. She withdrew her sidearm and fired the remainder of magazine into its face, pulverizing the head into pulp. Dropping the sidearm onto the lifeless body, she continued her climb to safety. Halfway up the ladder, far enough away so she could no longer hear the carnage taking place below, tears filled Carissa's eyes. She paused, wrapped her arms around one of the rungs, and sobbed. She had failed. The team had shut down only one of the engines and lost 2 good men in the process. Kennedy probably would be alive right now if he didn't have to look after her. And if he had lived, he might have been able to shut down the other engine. Because of her, everyone was now stuck aboard ship. A part of her wanted to just drop back down to the lower deck and let the zombies put her out of her misery. Yet she could not let go because deep down, she knew that would just be another wasted life. So far, she had not done much good about ship, but at least topside she might be able to give solace to those waiting to die. Wiping her eyes on the sleeve of her blouse, Carissa resumed climbing. The ladder ended in another narrow compartment overlooking the promenade deck. She closed the hatch to block access to the ladder and exited the compartment. After being stuck for so long in the claustrophobic confines of the engine room and escape ladder, she yearned for the sound and smell of the ocean. Instead, she was greeted by terrified screams and inhuman moans. The stench of decay and shit assaulted her senses. Summoning every ounce of will, Carissa forced herself to move to the edge of the promenade deck and peer over the railing to the boat deck below. Scores of zombies from the lower decks had made their way onto the boat deck, fore and aft. They fed on hundreds of passengers, jammed from gunwale to bulkhead. Those passengers who tried to defend themselves were quickly overrun with the living dead, dragged to the deck and slaughtered. Others dropped to their knees and awaited death, some praying for salvation, some crying or screaming, too terrified to move, and some staring blankly into space, having lost their sanity. The rest ran around in a frenzy, trying to escape, knocking over those around them to be crushed by the panicked throngs, or being pushed down and trampled. As the zombies made their way along the deck, they left dozens of ravaged bodies behind them. A few were so savagely devoured that nothing remained to turn into the living dead. Most of the others quickly reanimated, stumbled to their feet, and set off to feed on their fellow passengers. Despite the ship still sailing ahead at close to full speed, several crew members had loaded one of the lifeboats with women and children and were carefully lowering it. As the lifeboat disappeared below Carissa's line of sight, 2 sets of zombies swarmed over the crew members. 4 others lumbered over the edge of the deck and toppled off the side into the boat. Farther forward, a dozen passengers commandeered a lifeboat and were trying to lower themselves to safety. They might have made it if anyone aboard had experience with working a pulley system. After only a few feet, a young woman on the aft loosened the lines too much. The rear of the boat dropped, spilling everyone into the ocean. Carissa watched as the passengers float alongside the length of the ship, for a moment thinking they might make it. As they passed the stern, each passenger got caught in the ship's undertow and was sucked into the propellers. The ship's wake turned crimson. Carissa became aware of moans much louder than others. Facing forward, she saw 4 zombies approaching about 50 feet away. Rather than try and escape, she stood still. Where would she run to? With the ship overrun by the living dead, running would only delay the inevitable. An explosion rocked the ship. A fireball formed on the boat deck just aft of midship, instantly incinerating dozens of passengers and zombies. The concussion hurled Carissa backwards against the outer bulkhead, knocking the wind out of her. She rolled onto her hands and knees, too dazed to stand. A loud ringing in her ears blocked out all other sounds. When she opened her eyes, the wooden deck seemed to spin beneath her. Carissa squinted and crawled toward the railing. She was vaguely aware of other explosions, rocking the ship, feeling the reverberations through the hull. Reaching the railing, Carissa pulled herself to her feet and steadied herself against the metal rung. Slowly, her senses returned. Looking up and down the length of the boat deck, Carissa saw the cruise ship in flames. Pillars of black smoke billowed from 4 gaping holes along the starboard hull below the waterline. The nearest explosion had collapsed a 20-foot section of the promenade deck, including the portion with the zombies coming after her. Bodies and debris littered the water to starboard. Dozens of zombies grasped for the living around them but sank beneath the surface, their arms flailing. Not that this gave the survivors a reprieve. They tried swimming away, only to get caught up in the water rushing into the breaches in the hull and sucked back into the sinking ship. Scanning the horizon, Carissa saw the sources of the explosion. A warship flying the U.S. ensign sailed about a mile off the cruise ship's starboard beam. The warship came out of a sharp turn to port that reversed its direction so it could make another pass. The cruise ship already had developed a 5-degree list. Metallic creaks and groans echoed from the interior, loud enough to rival the mayhem topside. At this rate, the ship would sink in minutes. Carissa noticed that they were slowing down. A glance aft confirmed it, for she no longer saw a wake. The explosions must have knocked the remaining engines offline, which was lucky for her. She now had a fighting chance. Racing along the deck, Carissa made her way toward the stern. Thankfully, the farther aft she went, the fewer zombies she encountered. Most of the living dead congregated midships where the food was. She reached down the stairs leading down to the boat deck, rushed down them, ran over to the guardrail overlooking the stern, and climbed over. It was a 50-foot drop to the ocean, but if she jumped correctly, she'd be able to make the dive without hurting herself. At least she no longer had to be concerned about being chewed up by the propellers. Carissa heard the zombie a moment before it grabbed her by the shoulders. Clutching the guardrail with her right hand, she jerked her body to the left to break its grip. The maneuver worked, but only for a second. Driven into a frenzy by its insatiable hunger for flesh, the zombie continued to grasp at her. Alerted by the noise, 5 more moved in their direction. She might be able to hold off one of the living dead, but not a half dozen. 2 more explosions rocked the cruise ship. Carissa felt the stern rise out of the water and crash back down. The jolt knocked her right hand from the guardrail, and she plummeted backwards. Unable to execute a dive, Carissa struggled to keep her feet pointing down. She hit the water harder than anticipated and felt a sharp pain shoot through her side. The entire world closed in around her as she sank beneath the surface. For a moment, Carissa became dangerously disoriented, unable to determine the way to the surface. She frantically looked around to get her bearings, finally spotting the sun's reflection above her. Carissa swam toward the light, but slowly finding it difficult to move her right arm. Each stroke sent a wave of pain across her chest, driving air from her lungs at an alarming rate. Her lungs strained to inhale. Unable to hold her breath any longer, Carissa sucked in a mouthful of air just as she broke to the surface. The cruise ship pulled away from Carissa, now much slower, driven only by its momentum. Its list had increased the more than 20 degrees. Passengers clung onto fixtures and guardrails as zombies toppled over the side, occasionally clutching onto one of the living and pulling them to a watery grave. The ship drifted along for another quarter of a mile. Suddenly, the moaning of strained and twisted metal emanated from deep inside the hull, and the ship's list increased sharply. The Sea Princess rolled onto its side, spilling everyone still on the deck into the ocean. Terrified screams and cries for help mixed with the ship's death throe. The bow slid beneath the surface, followed a moment later by the stern lifting out of the ocean at a 45-degree angle, its propellers pointing skyward. The cruise ship slid beneath the surface, the undertow pulling both the living and the living dead into the deep. Seconds later, an unnatural silence descended across the ocean. A half-flooded lifeboat that had broken loose from its moorings floated a few hundred yards away. Carissa swam to it, crawled inside, and collapsed in the water-filled bottom. Exhausted and panting from the pain in her side, despite the throbbing, Carissa felt a sense of relief. She made it. She was alive. Carissa's spirits sank as she glanced up to see the U.S. warship gliding to a stop alongside her. Half a dozen soldiers lined the starboard beam, each training a semi-automatic rifle on her. A young inside stood amongst them, a bullhorn clutched in his right hand. He raised it to his mouth. Carissa winced, expecting to be cut down. Instead, the ensign yelled down to her, "Are you infected or wounded in any way?" Carissa shook her head vigorously so as to be seen from the deck. "Okay, ma'am, listen carefully. We're going to lower a ladder to you and bring you on board. Do exactly as you're told and make no sudden movements, otherwise we'll be forced to shoot you. Do you understand?" Carissa nodded. The inside lowered the bullhorn and issued orders to the men on the deck. 3 of them raced off to get the ladder, while the others kept their weapons trained on her. At this moment, she was in too much pain to care. All that mattered was that she survived both the outbreak and the sinking of her cruise ship, the only one of almost 3,000 people to do so. Most importantly, the zombies had sent to the ocean bottom and would never infect land. 10 days later, Virginia Beach. The sun had set hours earlier, driving the late summer vacationers off the beach and into the restaurants and clubs along Atlantic Avenue. No one was around to notice the lone figure that emerged from the ocean and stumbled its way onto the sand. It wore the remnants of a cruise ship captain's uniform. After more than a week walking along the ocean floor, much of its skin that had not already been eaten by sea life sloughed off from being waterlogged. Pausing on the sand, it adjusted to this new environment. A moment later, a second zombie emerged from the ocean, this one a woman in a tattered remnants of a sundress, its gut torn open and its abdomen empty of all its internal organs. It dragged itself across the sand and joined the first zombie. Up and down the length of the beach, more and more of the living dead trudged out of the watery depths. After a few minutes, more than 50 zombies stretched out along the beach for a quarter of a mile. They all stood tottering on the sand, getting their bearings. Almost as one, their collective attention was drawn toward Atlantic Avenue. The zombie in the cruise ship's captain's uniform gurgled, as if issuing a command. One by one, the zombies set off up the beach, stumbling for the lights and sounds along the boulevard that signified where they could find food. Thank you all so much for listening. This again was part 1 of an anthology written by Scott M. Baker. Don't forget to hit the like and please subscribe to the channel. For more information, follow the links in the description. And don't forget to also follow our new channel, Introverts Extroverting on YouTube. The link is below. Thanks again, and don't forget to stay scary.